Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm, as good as a person can be after spending the last 5 hours reading a 1,500-page murderer's manifesto.
Right. And,
which is, well, let's introduce ourselves, but that's basically what we're here to talk about today.
right. I'm Michael Brendan Dougherty. I'm a contributing editor at The American Conservative, which has the distinction of being quoted in this manifesto. And you are?
And I'm Michelle Goldberg. I'm a senior writer for Newsweek and the Daily Beast. And this this manifesto is quite, I thought, remarkable because it almost seems to have sprung fully formed out of a liberal's worst imaginings of a conservative. I mean, it doesn't seem, he's obviously a very disturbed person. The evil of this attack is, kind of unparalleled or not unparalleled, but, is kind of up there even in the history of mass terrorist atrocities, the way he, kind of methodically called all of these young people out under the guise of being there to protect them, and then kind of methodically shot them all down. But the strange thing about this manifesto, I thought, is that unlike, for example, and I still actually think that Loeffner, Jared Loeffner, who shot Gabrielle Giffords, there was references to a lot of right-wing conspiracy theories in his manifesto, but he was also kind of pretty clearly psychotic or schizophrenic, or, he was clearly kind of disturbed and had somewhat of a weak grip on reality.
Right.
This manifesto, parts of it could be published or might seem like they could be excerpted from, say, the American Conservative. He echoes very much writers like Mark Steyn or Pat Buchanan or all of the many, many, many kind of either self-described anti-jihadist or anti-immigrant writers that have long been warning that Europe is going to be turned into Eurabia.
Yeah. He not only sounds like them, he actually lifts. A lot of the stuff, it's not always clear in the text, but a lot of it is just simply copy and pasted. Imagine how disturbing it is for me to read this. And you're right. The thing that has most upset me is the kind of infernal logic on display here. Like I said, he doesn't give evidence of being insane, and in fact, he's impressive in the way the devil is impressive. An insane person can bomb a building, but for a sane person to methodically gun down young men,
and after planning it for many years and having a police costume,
and that's the other thing, planning it for years. In a way, he's a more, as I said, devilishly impressive terrorist than Osama bin Laden. He is. One of the kind of, I think, important things here is the extent to which he mirrors Al Qaeda, right? He, not only in his kind of complaints about European weakness and decadence, but, kind of tactically, he seems to have very much decided to match Al Qaeda. And one of the things that I'm interested in, and we can talk about this a little bit, the kind of religious aspect. I know that initially there were reports that he was a Christian fundamentalist, and I think we both pretty clearly agree that that's not the case. But there is a lot in here of him feeling maybe emasculated next to the kind of swaggering Muslims that he writes about growing up next to. There seems to be a real envy of Muslim solidarity, especially when he talks about his past as a kind of a hip-hop kid who wanted to hang out with the Pakistani gangs. Yeah, it is, it's funny, I'm glad you and I are talking about this, because so much of that initial reporting seemed lazy and sloppy, right? It's just, even from the Norwegian authorities themselves.
Well, yeah, but it's actually not lazy, and it's not really their fault. I mean, the police said that he was a Christian fundamentalist. It's not lazy.
Right, no, that's what I mean. I'm kind of attributing it back to them. I guess it's...
And I also think that, look, if you're in a secular country, this person commits these atrocities, the first thing you read is this, obviously they're not going to read through this 1,500-page manifesto, but at first glance, he talks about how his goal is to reestablish Christendom in Europe.
Yeah, as a Christian monoculture, and to give it a monopoly right on education. No.
Right, so I don't think it was, I don't think he's not a religious fundamentalist, but I don't think that was an insane conclusion for them to draw.
Right, and I may be, the thing is, you and I, the metaphor that springs to mind is, some people just walk into the grocery store and they drop fruit in their basket, and then there are other people that grab it and then they feel the suppleness of the fruit, they smell it, they look for little colors and subtleties to recognize the ripest fruit. And I feel like you and I both are those kind of experts when it comes to right-wing, like extreme right-wingers. And and so it is obvious. It was just obvious to me that a fundamentalist Christian would not be quoting John Stuart Mill and Franz Kafka and William James and things like that.
Wait, I'm actually not totally sure about that. I mean, I'm trying to think about, say, like R.J. Rushdoony's Institutes of Biblical Law. I mean, he certainly quotes a lot of people, kind of from the Western, I can't remember offhand, but quotes a lot of people from the Western philosophic.
Right, well, I mean, they discuss them, but it's like if you were upping yourself up for battle and you're a Christian fundamentalist, you'd be quoting, like, the Psalms of David or the Book of Revelation.
Right, and I don't think he doesn't really get into the Bible much at all, if I'm correct.
Right.
I mean, at least I didn't see very many biblical quotations.
Right, and most of in their manifesto, even though he talks about restoring Christendom and he urges this weird oath for his fellow knights, the religious section of it is incomplete, and it's in page 1200. It's not exactly the thing that seems to be original to him and on the forefront of his mind is who are the traitors and how to kill them.
Well, I also think there's another point, though. Although you're right that so he's not a Christian fundamentalist. He is, however, I've used the phrase Christian nationalist in the context of American politics. He's very clearly that in the context of Norwegian politics. But he's also obsessed with, he's even more than Islam in certain ways. He's obsessed with feminism. And he's obsessed with the kind of breakdown of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
In certain ways, he almost describes, I've heard this from other right-wingers, they almost see the kind of what they see as the Muslim demographic threat to Europe as a, as less a kind of a cause than a symptom of a broader rot that they see as being kind of endemic to secularism and particularly to feminism. His anger at women is incredibly striking, and it's in that context, it's worth noting that he didn't really set out after, say, a mosque or a Muslim. He went after the heart of Norwegian liberalism.
Yeah.
That's in certain ways his real target.
No, absolutely, that's his target. It's not even debatable. The only, in the manifesto, he sort of urges killing Muslims, for random fun, but they are, if you kill a Muslim in his hierarchy, you've done a lower deed. Unless it's a Muslim woman, which is a higher deed, because he believes that by targeting Muslim women, you can provoke Muslims into attacks on Europeans, which will further polarize Europeans and the Muslim immigrants and second and third generation Muslims living in Europe. So, it's sometimes I'm just at a loss of what to say.
One of the things, he does quote all of these, like, fairly mainstream conservatives, and I actually, I don't think it's fair to, in some ways, I think it's fair to say, attribute, or when somebody kind of commits violence in the United States, say when somebody shoots up the Tides Foundation after Glenn Beck has been ranting about the Tides Foundation, week in and week out, there's a kind of a connection that you can make, that you can say that Glenn Beck incited this. If he's not responsible, he certainly helped create the environment. I mean, that's not really the case here. I actually think that, people like Melanie Phillips or Mark Stein or some of these writers that he cites, although I think that they are, egregious, they maybe incite violence against Muslims. There's not a lot in their writing that would kind of lead in any sort of logical way to this atrocity.
Right.
But I do wonder what the link is, because they did clearly create the ideology that he's working out of, and and they also kind of created a lot of the this misconception, this idea that kind of feminism has weakened Europe and has created a demographic crisis that is going to be filled by kind of Muslim hordes, is a staple of the right, particularly the right in Europe. In my second book, when I wrote about the Polish right, there's a big connection in Europe, much more so than here, to kind of anti-abortion rhetoric and anti-Muslim rhetoric. The idea is if we have less abortions, we'll have fewer immigrants.
Right.
And it's actually a completely backwards argument, because it's weird. At certain points, he cites Japan as being a kind of example of this sort of patriarchal monoculture that he would like to see. But Japan's birth rate is catastrophically low.
Right.
As are Norway has one of the highest birth rates in Europe, as does all of Scandinavia, because there's, a huge amount of evidence now to show that if you kind of want to raise birth rates in developed countries, you do it through feminism. You do it through, kind of better work family policies and subsidized daycare. And there's really a direct connection in developed countries between social conservatism and cratering birth rates, which...
Well,
I wish...
it's not always. Ireland had really high birth rates until... Wait,
say that again?
Ireland had really high birth rates until it became had more modern attitudes about family.
Oh, I said in but that was after kind of its economic... Once countries reach a certain stage of kind of economic development, there is a direct connection between, once women have kind of all of the options of a modern information technology kind of economy, if they don't have some kind of rich array of social services, and the United States is complicated this doesn't totally apply in the United States for a couple of complicated reasons, but this is pretty... Ireland is one of the only countries, even now Ireland's birth rate is relatively high, but it's one of the only countries in the world that has both a kind of very strong, that's both a first world country with a very strong Catholic ethos, where the birth rate is still relatively robust, right? Like the birth rates that are the lowest in Europe are like Poland, Spain,
yeah.
Italy. So again, I'm not sure. It's not really fair to say that he was exactly motivated by these right-wing demographic doomsayers.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's kind of fascinating to see that this huge wave of conservative misinformation has now, has now to some extent inspired such a crime.
Right. You can imagine it happening on the other side too, I suppose. Although the thing is that liberals tend to just not like guns and violence as much. But I've read tough rhetoric from the left in the past decade too. The American left. Chris Hedges suggesting in Harper's and in his book that a theocratic fascism is brewing in America, and that the polite rules of democracy are insufficient for dealing with it. That could be, that could easily be dropped into a manifesto and look at home too. But it wouldn't make Chris Hedges responsible if someone blew up Saddleback Church or something like that. But it's
But, I mean, does it feel like it must feel uncanny, though? I mean, I imagine that there are at least some of the ideas in this manifesto are you share.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's violence in any way.
Yeah, I don't have any, in a way, it's like I don't have any compunction about saying that I share some of those ideas. I don't have any worry. Well, I guess I have worry if people are going to smear me as a terrorist, something, but, I feel like the most mild-manner reactionary around. And, my view for advancing, socially conservative ideas is to make them seem moderate and obvious. I want Olympia Snow advocating my ideas, not like Timothy McVeigh. I mean, that's the direction I would work in constantly. I want Nancy Pelosi to advocate my ideas. And I don't believe politics. I was discussing this with a family member, and I just don't think right-wing terrorism works the way that this. I actually don't even know how to pronounce his name, Breivik or Breivik. I don't think it.
Well, yeah, actually, I don't. Yeah, well, it kind of obviously doesn't work the way.
Right, because I mean,
he couldn't. He on it like nobody could have done more to discredit anti-jihadist ideology than he just did. And again, there's something weird. Like all the reporting I've seen says that this manifesto is legit. There still seems something quite odd about it to me. In part because it's hard to imagine somebody writing a manifesto that is so it has really little to do with Norwegian politics, and it seems kind of, there are a lot of things that maybe people like me assume crazy right-wingers think. For example, I think a lot of liberals assume that a lot of extreme reactionary politics comes from feelings of emasculation, and it's really rare to have somebody come out and say that, but he basically says that he feels like his leftist matriarchal upbringing has feminized him in kind of terrible ways.
Yeah.
So there's some.
It's funny. He actually has this weird discussion. I don't know if you ran across it, where he talked about how right wingers underestimate the power of sex in politics, and he even says basically that Europe should create Las Vegas-like zones for liberals and promise liberals unlimited sex in them. And I guess that's where it gets really bizarre, right? I mean, those are not positions advocated by anyone that you would confuse with a mainstream right-winger. I mean, those are, I've heard right-wingers say that, they like the idea that Las Vegas exists and that, there's a multiplicity of laws and expectations so that you can preserve, more conservative places. But the idea of, rewriting the map of Europe and creating a...
Right, he talks about creating liberal zones where contraception would be allowed and kind of conservative zones where it wouldn't.
Yeah, and... I mean...
But the extent to which I think it's a remarkable document in kind of tracing the way sexual anxiety and fears about being kind of unmanned create an entire reactionary politics. I mean, I don't know
if that's the only thing...
This had been dreamed up...
I don't know if that's the only... I don't want to attribute...
Well, of course, it's not the only thing happening. It's 1,500 pages.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a... there's a lot going on, and it's almost too big to digest. What do you make of? I mean, what's interesting, right, is that there are no. I can't think of any intellectual that is anywhere mainstream that would step up and and defend Breivik's act, or try to explain it, right? Where try to rationalize it and say, because in the cases of terrorism around the world, there's usually I don't know, a successful terrorist campaign would have a cadre of non-terrorist intellectuals or a fascist conspiracy in the military to join up with and make excuses for the terrorists and say that, so the terrorist makes demands A, B, and C and says, if you don't, I'll kill you. And then the intellectual says, you should give in a little bit on A, B, and C and take the wind out of the terrorists' sails. And I can't think of a single intellectual that would say that, well, if European nations just allowed a little bit more talk about immigration policy, they wouldn't get this. Especially since, by all appearances,
let's hope that that's true. I think we might see in the next couple of days.
Maybe.
And and it also kind of depends on what the definition of intellectual is.
Right.
And I don't think you're going to hear that.
Right. Well,
you're not going to hear that from intellectuals. I would, I'd be willing to put a small amount of money on the fact that there's something like that from Fox News.
All right. Do you want to wager?
A small amount of money. I'm not super convinced, but I also think it's not unlikely.
We should wager lunch on it.
Okay.
But I will say it's just gosh, what was the point I was going to make? So I don't think
you were going to make the point that there's. I guess the difference in certain ways between this and say like jihadist terrorism is that there's not a broader intellectual superstructure supporting it.
Right, or explaining it. And I'm not interested in scoring points against, Islamic terrorism and saying, like, we're being, be fair to right-wing murderers. But,
well, the one thing I do, again, I don't want to score points. I actually, like I said, I feel, I actually don't think it's fair to lay this at the feet of the writers quoted in it. People like Mark Stein and Patrick Buchanan.
Yeah.
I really don't. But what I do think is fair to lay at their feet is to say, every time you complain that when a Muslim terrorist, when there's some kind of terrorist atrocity by an Islamic fundamentalist, and you start hearing all these complaints, well, where are the moderate Muslims? Why aren't they out protesting? Why aren't they out distancing themselves from this sort of thing? I don't think that any of these writers are going to feel any need to protest or distance themselves from this sort of thing because they probably understand that it is self-evident that they're not, that this is not their fault and not something that they're associated with.
Although I came out yesterday and I was actually getting pissed off on Twitter about everyone calling them, not that I'm a fundamentalist Christian, maybe by some definitions I am, I'm a Catholic, but I was getting mad, and people were asking, why are you so upset that they're calling him a fundamentalist Christian? And I was like, even before I read the manifesto where he says he does not basically believe in God or anything like that, I just knew, and so I felt like, not that I needed to distance himself, I needed to distance myself, but that I wanted to distance him from...
Right, well, I guess my point... Right, but you just... you just said kind of that you have no compunction saying that there's elements of this manifesto that you agree with.
Yeah.
You don't feel any need and you don't have any expectation of people... Of having to kind of stand up and account for yourself.
Right, and actually...
stand up and account for social conservatives.
And this actually has...
And so I guess my point is that if anyone who... If they kind of want that, benefit of the doubt, which I think that they actually deserve, they have to be willing to kind of understand that other movements are similarly unmonolithic,
right,
and to stop tarring all Muslims with the brush of a few. I think that again, although you cannot lay this crime at the feet of these writers, I do think that the kind of like perfect inversion of the whole thing does demonstrate how what bullshit so much of their work is.
Well, and actually, feel that I changed my mind, or maybe it's something that I didn't change my mind about, but there's something I never thought about that you're touching on here, and where maybe I've changed a position. But my experience yesterday of saying there's no way that this guy is a fundamentalist Christian. I know fundamentalist Christians. It actually makes me question. I used to joke about how people would say, "Oh, well, if Muslim committed a terrorist act, he must not be a true Muslim. He mustn't be, because Islam means peace," and we kind of create this protection around it. But it definitely gives me an appreciation that Justice Breivik, if that's how you pronounce his name, wanted to see a hegemonic Christian and Catholic culture imposed on Europeans, while not himself, being a churchgoer, a member of a church, or feeling like he needed to convert to Catholicism. It makes me think that before we say that it's a Muslim who committed an act of terrorism, maybe we should look into whether he actually attends a mosque, or
right. And this is actually not that uncommon.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, when you look at kind of people who commit terrorism in the name of Islam, although some of them, I mean, it seems like Osama bin Laden is quite devout. A lot of them aren't devout. Right. They're basically religious nationalists.
Right, and it's funny too, because the way this mirrors is so weird. At the end of this document, Breivik talks about wanting to hire high-end prostitutes, in the week before he commits these crimes. Now, it's not been reported that he did that yet, but that's exactly what terrorists, supposedly did before 9/11, was go to strip clubs, and it is eerie how he mirrors his enemy, his supposed enemy, in even these other little details. But
I mean, that's like if somebody had either made up this whole scenario or had made up this document, it would be so unbelievable. I mean, because it kind of, history doesn't usually unfold in such kind of neat pairs of opposites, or, you know what I mean? It doesn't usually kind of unfold with such kind of stark and obvious analogies. There's something so very, very strange about the entire thing.
No, there is.
I mean, besides
Yeah, it's.
I was going to say, besides being hideous, it's also just deeply, deeply odd.
No, it's actually easy to almost get lost talking about how weird it all is, and forget to acknowledge just how awful it is. And it's amazing. He not only discredits. What's weird is all of his aims and his mental framework for his goals, his stated goals and his ideology are all right-wing nationalism, But his tactics, it's funny, he quotes, other books on revolution that aren't written by right-wingers. And I'm not saying his tactics are completely borrowed by the left, but they're certainly much more suitable for, a communist revolution or something like that. I mean, he talks endlessly, and this is going to be really fascinating to watch, since he did not put a bullet in his brain. He allowed himself to be captured, and that seems to be part of his plan. And he outlines intensely that, the idea for him is to now put the regime, multiculturalism, on trial during his trial. And I think that's going to be fascinating to watch. I mean, he wants, and other movements that have had violent and extremist ends try to do that. I mean, when IRA people were tried, they tried to put the English government on trial in their trial. They'd say, yes, and they'd say exactly almost what he's saying, which is that, yes, I did the deed, but I'm not criminally guilty. The regime is criminal for charging me. And, that's going to be amazing, and it's going to be really interesting to see how Norway's justice system deals with this. I mean, I think if this happened in America, we'd be having a debate right now. Should the trial be televised? What kind of reporting should be allowed out of it?
Well, the other thing is that, one thing that this has really, this has also done the opposite of what he intended, in that it seems to have shined a light on Norway in a lot of ways is one of the best countries in the world. It's the most generous country in the world per capita when it comes to foreign aid. It's like a very beloved country. But one of the results of all this is to shine a light on just what a decent and humane place it is. The speech that the Prime Minister gave about kind of upholding freedom and humanistic values in the face of barbarism was both inspiring and also, I think, a little bit unimaginable in the American context, when nobody would want to hear about, people would be much more hungry for talk of vengeance and that sort of thing. I mean, he's not, he's going to kind of completely fail to put the regime on trial, because the regime in this case has absolutely nothing to answer for, which is different than in the case of, say, England, Ireland. Or
what do you make of the? I mean, we touched on this, but what do you make of the seeming aloneness of this act and the amount of years put into it? I think that's one of the most, by far, striking things about it.
Well, and I don't think we know yet whether he was totally alone.
Right.
I also think that there's a real danger. I mean, he's being described as kind of a lone wolf, and that's, in certain ways it's true. I think everybody who studies right-wing terrorism says that right-wing terrorism is more likely to be kind of quote-unquote lone wolf terrorism than kind of based on cells or that sort of thing. But at the same time, if he had been a Muslim, even if he had absolutely no human connection to anyone else, but he just kind of frequented jihad forums and quoted jihadist authors, even if he acted like 100% alone, nobody would consider that alone. They would consider him part of a political movement. Nobody would consider him kind of a lone wolf. And I think that there can be no doubt this is someone who was part of a political movement.
Was Hassan really treated as part of a political movement? I mean, it's not like there were...
Wait, say that again?
Was the Fort Hood shooter considered...
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, do you know how much... Yes, of course he was. That's why, I mean, so much of what he did was connected to the cleric in Yemen.
Right, but they talked about that. I mean, that was all talked about. But it's not like, they... I don't feel like there was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't feel like there was a search for other cells in the military or an explanation. I mean, it was actually... No, you're right. But he was assumed to be part of Al-Qaeda in some amorphous way. I mean, partly because Al-Qaeda in a lot of ways no longer exists, right? So now they say, well, Al-Qaeda is just this dispersed network of people acting on their own initiative, which is... in some ways, I'm sure a correct analysis, but it's also in some ways kind of a cop-out, because it allows any act by a lone wolf with an Al-Qaeda video on his laptop to be considered part of Al-Qaeda, and we just don't have the same kind of framework when we talk about right-wing terrorism. Right, although, the New York Times is leading with stories today about, it shines a light on right-wing movements in Europe, and, there are these kind of catch-all things about Geert Wilders or the Vlaamsblok or whatever still exists in Flanders of that. So, I mean, it's being, and no one's, I guess, saying that they're responsible. I guess there is a difference. But there is sort of a discussion that's happening about European right-wing movements.
Well, and I think that discussion should happen, right? I mean, that's obviously, how would that discussion not happen when you have, But I guess, to me, the difference is that there's still... I think that in certain ways, again, because it's such a kind of precise analogy to the way Al-Qaeda works, it also shines a light on the fact that a lot of times these connections between people we think of as Al-Qaeda terrorists and some overarching jihadist entity are much flimsier and more tenuous than we might be willing to admit. And it becomes much more obvious, I think, when you see it in its mirror image.
Right. No, and like I said, I mean, just watching this has, altered some of my sub-views of Islamic terrorism. I mean, and who are the people that carry it out and for what reason. Or at least it's opened my mind to other possibilities in the kind of framework we're always given. Do you... I mean, in one way, there's always a temptation on these dialogues to try to draw like some big lessons, and on this sort of one, the temptation is to say there is no lesson. This is totally sui generis. This is it's.
I think there are a lot of. I mean, I think there are a lot of lessons, and again, I think that it's not necessarily that there are like a lot of lessons that we should be kind of scoring a lot of political points with it.
Mm-hmm.
There are obvious, I think, again, like I said, one of, to me, the most striking things here is the kind of the misogynist roots of this whole thing. One of the reasons I've often written about gender politics is because I think people really underestimate the extent to which fights over feminism and the role of women and, the structure of the family underlie kind of much more titanic political battles all over the world, right? That was the subject of my last book. Again, I don't want to say that this, terrible, terrible thing, proves my thesis. That's not what I want to say. But I do think that it's, again, I think that maybe the role of misogyny in kind of broader reactionary movements is something that I think is incredibly important, and it would be hard to imagine a more kind of stark example of that. And I think, and again, I also think it's incredibly important in jihadist terrorism.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's funny. I have actually a couple of lessons too, I think. On one hand, I would blame, what do you blame for this? I guess my blame and my lesson are contain kind of the same thing. So I think right-wing people, he doesn't talk about alienation or atomization very much. But I can't...
But he does a little
bit. A little bit, but I can't think of a more atomized person than Breivik. And it was striking to me, a couple things. I mean, if there are radical right-wingers listening to Blogging Heads, I would say that not only does Breivik discredit hard right views, but he went about promoting them in exactly the opposite way. If those views were ever to become more mainstream, it would be... I mean, right-wingers are about defending the order and legitimizing the established order. And so you do that by not destroying the very people you say you want to save, but literally by joining groups, by being part...
Wait, I don't think you can say that that's true. I don't think you can say that about right-wingers. I think you can say that about conservatives in the genuine classical sense. Right,
in the classical sense. But I mean, I think...
But you certainly, I mean, there's like a whole history, a long history of kind of, the history of fascism is the history of, kind of right-wing radical
revolutionary movements,
transformation and hatred of the existing order.
Right, revolutionary movements, but it's notable that, and that's the thing is the only successful right-wing terror campaigns have been aligned with fascist conspiracies in the military and have had some elite intellectual support, right? And this has none of that. I mean, I don't think there's a cadre of fascist intellectuals in Norway that are going to defend or excuse what happened here, as we said earlier. But I think my broader point, though, is that, his vision, yes, his means were all fascist, but his vision, right, was for this sort of rooted monocultural Europe. And, the way to achieve anything like more stable families or, whatever he wants is by joining existing institutions and building them up, And that's why I almost knew instinctively he was not a regular church member. Because regular church members, maybe they run a Bible study or they bake, casseroles or something like that.
Well, that's not actually true. I mean, I don't think that you can say that regular church members are never involved in right-wing terrorism.
No, not never.
Certainly.
No, maybe not never, but I mean, my larger point is that, if the hard right wants to create a future, I mean, join, some kind of extremist bloggers. I was looking around some of the more extreme bloggers to get their reaction and see if they were denouncing this or to test my hypothesis.
Were they?
No, I didn't see any of that. I saw a lot of people saying this is the most counterproductive thing possible. But one made the more dramatic point that, if this guy's a fascist, he should be recruiting the kids at the youth camp, not shooting them. And that he should have, his aim should have not been to be Timothy McVeigh, but Deng Xiaoping, to join the institutions and then transform them from within. And I actually think that this guy had a point about that. And not only that, but I mean, joining a political party doesn't involve murdering people in the most wanton way, which,
Well, I mean, the other thing, but also, I mean, in certain ways it seems, it actually seems kind of ghoulish to even say, well, to talk about this being problematic because it was counterproductive.
Right, no, I agree,
I understand that that's not what you're saying, but I also think that, he doesn't, I think that a lot of these, again, part of the reason I kind of keep going back to the sexual politics underlying this is because, even though he's written or cut and paste 1,500 pages of quite involved political theory, underneath this seems to be about a much more kind of elemental anger, a much more elemental sense of being emasculated, just something much more kind of the id than the superego.
Well, and I should deepen my point. I don't mean to say that this guy's tactics were just wrong and people should reject the tactics. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the tactics spring out of, I guess my point is the tactics spring out of ideologizing all of the things he sees as problems. So he's not actually a Christian that goes to a church and listens to the authority figure in the church, maybe a priest or a pastor who says, hey, help out in the soup kitchen. That would be an actual Christian identity. His Christian identity is completely ideological and abstract. And his ideas about Europe are completely abstract. I mean, he literally, and he talks about this in his manifesto of separating himself from everything in his life. That he's barely hanging out with friends, barely communicating with family, partly to conceal his activities, and then also to prepare him to take them out.
Yes and no. I mean, I think that's partly what he's doing, and I think that's partly what he's doing, and I also think that's partly how he's kind of rationalizing his extreme aloneness.
Right. No, I think that's part of it. But that's what I'm talking about, is that ideological, that ideologizing of it. He talks about Christian identity, he talks about Europe, but there's no part of his lived life that's anything like that. And I feel like that is a solve to this. I mean, I believe families, churches, civic institutions, even to some degree party politics, help moderate people and also help save them from this disease of ideologizing everything. So that's I guess that was my broader point. And I think it's consonant with what you're saying about his kind of elemental issues about women and other things. If he talks about his reluctance to even date women, maybe if he got to know a woman. I'm not saying that just getting to know the right girl, he wouldn't have done this, but there's something to be said for living life, or, for not...
right, but the thing is that this is, in certain ways, this is the manifesto and the work of somebody who feels kind of unfairly excluded from their own life.
Right. It's actually amazing, too, that he tips his hand throughout this, talking about even how many sexual partners he thinks his sister has had, and or his mother, or his stepfather, and what sexually transmitted diseases they have. I couldn't agree with you more that that's all in there, and his anxiety over that, real and imagined. And it's also sad to see the reports this afternoon that his family did not seem to know anything about this. I mean, he was disconnected from seemingly everything, except websites. Anyway,
let's wrap it up. Let's wrap it up there.
Yeah.
I actually have to file a story about exactly some of the things that we were talking about.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, I don't think I can write on this actually for a while.
You should, though, actually, because I think that's kind of, what you were talking about before about the new light it sheds on the difference between, the new light it sheds on kind of the Islam, about
right.
kind of when people say that this isn't Islam. I mean, that's really interesting.
Right. I mean, it is. And it's funny. And also, because it engendered in me this kind of protective reaction, like I wanted to protect the label fundamentalist Christian, even though I'm not one, I guess, because I know so many. That should be made clear to a lot of these writers on the right who become offended when Muslims try to protect their own credibility. And yeah, I just assumed everyone would know I'm a civilized person and find what Breivik did to be utterly infernal and horrifying. It almost seems trivial to put those words to it.
Right.
They seem...
Right, yeah, they seem trite kind of in this, given the kind of just how...
Right, and that's also why I wasn't ever inclined to go to Twitter and say, fundamentalism has been hijacked, and,
right.
I actually feel bad. I mean, in a way, I almost wish CARE would stop issuing press releases condemning Islamic terrorism. I mean, it's like...
Right, but they have no choice.
I guess they don't, but I mean...
Whenever, because God forbid if they didn't, we would never hear the end of it.
Right, and also,
And so I think what it should do, we should wrap this up, but one thing that I would... So that maybe this is a cheap political point, but I would like to see this put an end to the calls every time, every time that there is an act of terrorism for people who share that, religious faith or ethnic heritage to be expected to answer for.
Yeah, it's an ideological show trial, right? And by even asking the question, you are implying a kind of guilt by association. Mm-hmm. Right, and it's really kind of disgusting, and it should remind conservatives, and many of them lived through the Cold War. It should remind them of the way the Soviets treated dissidents and suspected dissidents, and so they should be horrified. I agree with you. Maybe I will write that. I also like this point about just how abstract and ideological he made his beliefs and identity, because he made this identity-based appeal, and yet he didn't hang out with anyone that even shared his identity or even his views, except digitally. It's sickening and weird. Yeah. But anyway, we should leave it there. This has been great. I'm really glad.
It was good talking to you.
Yeah, I'm glad you and I got to speak about this. And we'll talk to you soon, hopefully under a better news cycle.
Yeah, no, I hope so too.
All right, take care, Michelle.
Bye-bye.
Bye.